When my new client asked ChatGPT how to handle tantrums, it told her not to give attention during or after a tantrum, so the behavior would not be rewarded. And she asked me, what if my child is genuinely upset and needs comforting? How do I support them without reinforcing the behavior that I don't want to see? This is such a great question, and it's one that I'm willing to bet almost every single one of you has struggled with too. So, in today's episode, let's unpack it. I'm going to share with you my thoughts on how to support your kids the way that they need and deserve without reinforcing and worsening the behaviors that you don't want to see. Welcome to Single Parenting with Connection, Not Perfection, the podcast that honors your messy reality. It's the support you crave without the usual emotional landmines. I'm your host, Dr. Gila, and I promise I will never tell you to just tag your partner in. Before we start, quick reminder. While I am a licensed psychologist and a certified coach, this podcast is not coaching and it's not therapy, and it's not a replacement for medical or psychological advice. It is for educational and informational purposes only. All right, let's dive in. So, should you ignore your child's tantrums, their meltdowns, and other behaviors that you want to reduce or get rid of? And if you don't ignore them, is that rewarding and reinforcing the behavior? Now, underneath this question is a bigger question, and I think we need to talk about that first. The question underneath here is, what works in parenting? You might have noticed that different sources, different experts or websites or books that describe themselves as being empirically based or science-backed or data-driven, all of those terms, that they might ultimately give the polar opposite advice. Timeouts are a good example of this. There are empirically based sources that say timeouts are absolutely the best way to handle undesirable behavior. And then there are other sources that are science-backed and empirically based that say timeouts are not a recommended strategy. So what gives? How are both of these things true? Well, in my opinion, a big piece of the answer is that when we're looking at the question, what works? We first need to answer the question, what is the problem and what is the desired outcome? And if we're defining those things in different ways, then we're going to have different answers. The advice about not rewarding behavior with your attention is a very behavioral perspective on what works. And behavioral approaches define the problem as the behavior, and the goal is a reduction or elimination in the behavior. So the approach is behavioral. Like rats in a maze, human behavior is naturally shaped by cues in our environment and by our experience. And I'm not saying that anyone who uses a behavioral approach thinks that humans are the same as rats. I want to be clear. But there are some commonalities. We are looking at behavior as a predictable and shapeable thing in humans, just as it is in animals in a lab. From my perspective, and I want to say everything that I'm saying today is my opinion and my perspective. It is, I believe, data-supported, science-backed, empirically based, but I recognize that not everybody will agree with me. So I'm sharing with you my perspective as a parent and as a psychologist and as a coach who brings a conscious parenting, connection-based parenting lens. And as a reminder, this kind of situation is really when your child is dysregulated, or as my client described it, times when her daughter seems to need comfort and support, like during a tantrum or a meltdown. Now, I know that a lot of people think there's a difference, an important difference between tantrums and meltdowns. I'm not going to get into that here. I'm just going to say that I'm talking about times when your child is dysregulated. There is, I think, a difference between this kind of dysregulated state and intentional boundary testing. So, for example, the toddler who's experimenting with throwing their cup on the floor, or the 6-year-old experimenting with swearing. These are times when they may be intentionally doing an activity and looking to see what your response is, what your reaction is. And that I think is a little bit different than what we're talking about here. So, in my opinion, there are two main problems with this purely behavioral approach, especially as it applies in this kind of situation. The first one is the lens. And when I say problem, I guess what I really mean is two things that I personally disagree with. So, this lens that the problem is entirely behavioral and the goal is entirely behavioral is not my perspective. I believe that behavior is communication. It is the tip of the iceberg. It is the manifestation of what's happening underneath. There are two underlying things that are really driving the behavior. Number one is the child is having a hard time. And they're having a hard time for any of a number of reasons. Maybe they don't have the skills to handle a particular situation. Maybe there are other things contributing that you're not even aware of. So we can take a deeper dive into that another time. But the general concept, the general point is that they are having a hard time. They are struggling. And the second problem is that they don't know how to communicate their feelings, how to get the support they need, how to advocate for themselves in a more socially acceptable way, and in some cases, in a more safe and less destructive way. So, yes, we do want to reduce or eliminate some of the behaviors, right? I am not saying that we should allow our kids to hit us and just accept that as how they handle frustration, for example. What I'm saying is that reducing or eliminating the behavior is not the only goal. And I would even argue there are other goals higher upstream that, if we address them, are actually going to be more effective in reducing and eliminating the behaviors without having unwanted consequences. And remember, ChatGPT's advice, as is often the advice from real humans also, is not about just ignoring the behavior, but about not giving attention to the child. So, by giving attention to the child when they are engaging in, or when they have just recently engaged in behaviors that we don't like, that giving them attention will then reward the behaviors. And I think it's really important to highlight that there's a difference between giving attention to the behavior and giving attention to the child. Because when we ignore the child and don't give attention and support to the struggling child, not only does it not help with those other two problems that I just mentioned, but it can actually have some negative outcomes. A big one is that it can compromise your connection with your child. It compromises their trust in you, which, in my opinion, is honestly your most valuable asset in parenting today, right now, and in the future. Think of the teenager. You want your teenager to come to you when they have really big, hard, prickly feelings. You don't want them to hit you, but you want them to come to you with those feelings, right? So while we might want to eliminate, extinguish certain ways that they're communicating their feelings, we want to encourage them to continue communicating the feelings to you. We want them to see you as a safe place, as someone who is going to love and support them unconditionally, even if the behavior itself, the manifestation, the way they're expressing it, is not something that you agree with. You can disapprove of the behavior without disapproving of the person. And you can work to reduce or eliminate the behavior without ignoring and reducing or eliminating your connection, your interaction, your relationship with the person. The other potential negative outcome is that it compromises their internal self concept, their self esteem, their inner narratives about themselves. And in my opinion, these are huge. So, this is where really clarifying and continuing to come back over and over again to what your values and mission and vision are for you as a parent, for your child, and for your relationship with your child. And in these tough moments, asking yourself, what response, what behavior on my part will be aligned with and get me closer to the goals that I have for my child, for myself as a parent, and for our relationship. And again, I would invite you to think of it in a bigger picture than, yes, our goal for the child is, for example, to not hit. But in a bigger picture way, our goal is for them to have the skills that they need in order to resist hitting and to express themselves, advocate for themselves, communicate their big feelings without hurting other people. I also want to point out that even from a purely behavioral lens, with a purely behavioral goal, these strategies don't always work and they sometimes backfire, especially with our strong willed kids or our neurodivergent kids. A lot of the parents that I work with have already tried sticker charts, reward systems, punishment, timeouts, and often these strategies don't just not work. They actually make things worse. They escalate the power struggles, the tantrums, the meltdowns, and of course, the parents' feelings of frustration and overwhelm, and usually the parents snapping and yelling and responding in ways that they don't feel good about. It's the cycle that we all know all too well. They need a different approach. So let's talk for a minute about this fear that the client was expressing. And I absolutely can relate to it. And I am pretty confident almost every single one of you can too, right? Here's the fear. If I give my child attention and support and love when they are engaging in behaviors that I don't like, it will reward and reinforce the behavior, and the behavior will happen more often. So, there are a few points that I want to make here. So, first, as I mentioned before, there are different kinds of quote unquote unwanted or undesirable behaviors. And how we respond to them is going to vary, and it varies based on a lot of different things, including the type of behavior and also the child and the parent and the relationship between the child and the parent, the context, and all of that jazz. But really, I just want to call out here that, for example, a child who is overwhelmed, dysregulated, really struggling is different than the child who is doing some intentional boundary testing. I also, again, want to highlight that there's a difference between giving attention to the behavior and giving attention to the child. So I can stay connected to my child. I can hold space for their feelings. I can support them without making a big to do, a big production about the specific behavior. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should never call attention to the behavior itself. There is a time and a place for that and a way to do that. But I just want to point that out, right? That attention to the behavior is not the same as attention to the child. And then, as an extension to that, not giving the behavior attention is different than intentionally withholding attention from the child. I know that might have sounded confusing. Let me say that again. So, not giving attention to the behavior is different than not giving attention to the child and is different than intentionally withholding attention from the child, right? So you can simply, be doing other things, not really like notice or pay much attention to what's happening, what the child is doing. And that's different than a child who's melting down in front of you and you intentionally and very overtly and like make a point of not paying attention to them, ignoring them. In terms of the question of whether giving the child attention during or immediately after something like a meltdown or a tantrum, if that could reinforce and therefore make it more likely that those behaviors are going to happen again, or specific behaviors when they were dysregulated. That's the underlying fear. And here's what I want to say about that. There could be some truth to this. If the only way your child can get your attention, can get your support, can get love and snuggles and empathy and validation is by quote unquote misbehaving, by engaging in behaviors that they know are going to be triggering for you and that they know that you don't like. If that is the only way that they can get your attention and your support, then yes, it may increase those behaviors, whether your child is doing it intentionally, consciously, or subconsciously. They want and need your attention. They're going to do what they know they can do to get your attention. And if that's the only way to get it, then yes, they may do it more often. This is why it is so important to build your connection outside of these hard moments, because we want them to know that they can get our support, our attention, our validation, our empathy, that we will see them, we will tend to them, we will attune to them, even when they're not having a hard time. The other thing I want to say is, again, there are elements of what's happening that we actually do want to reinforce. There are elements we don't. I understand that. And those are the behaviors. But there's a piece of what's happening that we do want to reinforce. We want to reinforce that you are their safe space. We want to reinforce that you will love and support them no matter what they do. We want to reinforce that when they have something they're struggling with, they can come to you, that they can express their big feelings to you, that they can advocate for their needs to you. We do want to address the behavior. We want to help them build the skills so that they can do all those beautiful things that we want to reinforce without it being hurtful or harmful to you or to anyone else. But we don't want to extinguish everything about it. So that's my soapbox. I hope it's helpful. In review, I think it's really important when these questions come up to think about, what is the lens? What is the goal? And what is the problem? And to really think of that in a bigger picture sense, not just the behavior that you're seeing in front of you, but your bigger picture goals and the bigger picture problems of what is driving the behavior that you don't like, that you want to reduce. And the other big piece here is that attention only given after problematic behavior is going to lead to problematic outcomes. And the answer to that is not to not give attention in those problematic times. The answer is to give attention at other times too. So your child doesn't have to scream bloody murder to know that you will give them the attention and the support that they need and that they deserve. I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions, please, you are always welcome to reach out to me. And if you are struggling with how to balance these conflicting needs and values and desires, you're not alone. And I am here to support you. So please feel free to reach out. My contact information is in the show notes, and I always love to hear from you. That's it for this episode. I am so glad you found your way here. And remember, even if you're on your own, you don't have to do it alone. You've got this.